last but not least, speaker for today, Professor Brad Sherman. Over to you, mate.
Thanks, Christine. I am going to focus today on the second part of the centre, not the plant part, the success part, which we tend to ignore. And the question that I want to talk about is how do we measure success and what does success look like? And is it getting plants in the ground, as we heard today, is so important in Florida at the moment, to do whatever they're meant to do. So that's the question I ask. Our group to date which consists of Robert Henry, Hamish McDonald and Beres Chanley, we've been looking at ensuring that the activities that we do are Nagoya compliant so it doesn't hinder the uptake and adoption of research, and that part of the work we're doing is coming to an end. And we're moving on now to think more broadly about what does success look like and how do you ensure that the wonderful work you're doing has an impact in the world. Over the last 10 to 15 years, there's been much more discussion and rhetoric about impact and translation. We have buildings that are called, translation centres. We fill out forms when we go for promotion where we show our impact. It's becoming much more important in the worlds in which we live in. But at the same time, we also live in a world where the intellectual property policies that we operate under are very much rooted in the 1980s. And I just want to talk about that today. The situation before the 1980s was one where things were freely available. In the movement of germplasm, international law and domestic law worked under the idea that the plants were the common heritage of humankind, which means basically Kew Gardens could go and take and steal from wherever they wanted and do what they want with it. So there was no international legal principles that stopped the movement of plants. Also, most of the outreach, most of the extension work was done by state governments, a lot depending on the broadacre crops, and particularly it was the Queensland Department of Agriculture that was giving, or the New South Wales Department of Agriculture was giving out Yipti wheat, not quite free to farmers, but certainly at cost. It differed from field to field, but most of the work in breeding and most of the work in distribution was being done by state agencies as part of their mission. Intellectual property didn't really exist on plant and plant innovations. The one exception really was the US Plant Patent Act, and that was fairly narrow in its scope. It was limited to sexually reproduced plants, and I'll talk more about that in a moment. Things began to change in the 1980s. It was a combination of a range of things, but I have a photograph somewhere of Thatcher and Ronald Reagan shaking hands when they developed an agreement on intellectual property for universities between those two places, and most other developed countries have followed suit since then. Plant breeders' rights were introduced in this period for the first time in Australia. The United States introduced the plant variety right protection at the same time. Plant patents, so utility patents, were granted for the first time in the United States and Australia and Europe shortly after in 1985 and 1986. The public sector bodies, the Australian Research Council, the NHMRC, the research development corporations, GADC and those organisations, up until then they had operated in a world in which they were intellectual property free. CSIRO was intellectual property free. In the 80s and 90s, suddenly everybody thought that if you weren't taking out intellectual property protection, if you weren't commercialising, you weren't doing the right thing. And we've got to the situation now where last year the top 5 patentees in Australia, CSIRO number 1, the next 4 are universities, all with public sector money. So our taxpayer dollars are being used by public institutions or quasi-public institutions to take out intellectual property protection. Okay, why? In the last couple of years, or last 4 or 5 years, there's been increased attention given to the question of, is this the right thing to happen? Is it right that University of Tasmania, or University of Queensland, has a commercialisation office to spend taxpayer money on lawyers to take out protection on something that we should be giving to the public for free? Post-COVID, the Biden administration has followed through in a way that hasn't been done before in the United States or elsewhere. The United States in 1980 introduced what was called the Bayh-Dole Act. This is a piece of law that basically said in situations where the federal government funds research, there's a right to march in to basically go and take a share of things. It's never been implemented. Following the behaviour of the large pharmaceutical companies in relation to the distribution of the vaccines in the United States and the way in which they gouged and upped the prices, the Biden administration has made a decision for the first time ever in the United States to go against those companies. They're demanding that Pfizer and the other companies that took out those patents that were based largely upon public sector funding, that the public should get a share of that for free. The European Union has introduced a commission to do the same thing. I spoke to someone this morning who went to a meeting last week in Canberra. The Australian government announced during the budget that they're spending money, setting money aside to think about and talk about what and how the future of public sector research might look like. So what might successful research look like? The ARC, the NHMRC and the RDCs and potentially CSIRO, but they're not part of the equation apparently at this stage, are all going to, the federal government's plan is that they're going to rethink how things go and how things progress. What we are planning to do in our group is to think what that might look like going forward. So what might success look like in relation to the adoption and uptake of research? At this stage, we're focusing on two particular areas, but we're going to build them as we go ahead. The first one we're looking at international agricultural distribution. So we're contrasting the Green Revolution, and there's been a considerable debate about the pros and cons, but one thing that's never been criticised is it was very successful in getting the technology out. And the key thing it did that is it gave it out for free. You know, there was Rockefeller funding behind it and things, but it was a free exchange. It was phenomenally successful, or whatever it might. It was successful in getting the technology out into the field. There's no doubt about that. The CGIR, the Consultative Group for International Agricultural Research Centres, is I think the largest agricultural research funding body in the world. It consists of 14, I think, different research centres that focus on different types of crops or different types of sort of agricultural products. About a decade ago, ILRI, the one that focuses on rice and CIMMYT, so ILRI in the Philippines and CIMMYT in Mexico City, both started to take out patents on ILRI, mainly in relation to the golden rice, and CIMMYT in relation to a whole range of things, but they started to take out a number of patents on their creations. The funders, the Gates, the Dutch government in particular, and the Ford Foundation basically called the consortium office to them at one of the annual meetings and said, this can't go on. Our reason we're giving out hundreds of millions of dollars a year is not to allow these people to take out patents. What it's for is to ensure poverty reduction and food security, and we're not going to allow that. There was pushback, and eventually the CG system introduced what's known as the intellectual asset policy. And this is a policy that basically says intellectual property protection, on the whole, is something that the CG centres should not adopt. However, there are some situations where it's important that we do that, and that would be situations where, for example, we cannot get things adopted and taken up. So, for example, the what's it called? There's a livestock centre in Kenya, whose name escapes me. Whatever it's called. Anyway, so they, was it? Okay, yeah, thank you. Who had developed a vaccine for some sort of tsetse fly or whatever, and so they knew what they had to do, but they couldn't work out how to get it into the animals. They partnered with an American pharmaceutical company, and what they did was they said that the product could be distributed for free in Africa and Asia, but in Australia, Canada, and the United States, the company who was commercialising it could take out intellectual property protection. And there are certain situations in those countries where people could apply for and get exemption. And that was taken by the CG as an example of a situation where the use of intellectual property protection was appropriate. The next thing that we're looking at is in relation to citrus in California at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century. One of the most phenomenal, successful organisations. It went from hardly any industry to it was as important as oil in California, and it was phenomenally successful at the time. It was done 100% on the basis of farmer cooperative growing. There was no money. All of the research was organised and funded, at least for a while, by the growers. All the breeding was done by growers. Everything was done by growers. It was a cooperative where people got together to work. It's an alternative model for distribution. We are beginning to think and talk about these issues going forward. And it's an issue, I think, that the EU, as I said, are looking into this at the moment. Australia, I understand that the government's gone into election mode, so the bureaucrats have stopped doing anything, so nothing will happen now. But it is something that's being discussed at present. So thank you.
That's a nice thing for us to think about over dinner tonight, hey? Any questions?
Yes, Peter.
Oh, Peter, that's unusual.
About these international agencies, taking out patents, you could argue that you would want to do this if you want to make it public, and that by getting a patent in early before a commercial company does, it gives you the ability to give it out for free to stop basically the retention of a monopoly in a company. Is that part of the thinking or not?
No, not at all. They were doing it to make money, basically. Or they were doing it because a sign of success, patenting was seen as a sign of success. People's CV, like I've had 27 patents, it's that sort of thing. Well, I don't really think it wasn't defensive patenting. And there's other ways to do it without taking out patents. You just make it publicly available.
Yeah, but you may remember with the human genes and the MRC in Cambridge that they took out patents, and then the guys in the US took out patents, and then it was a mutual tearing up of these patents that made it impossible to patent human genes.
Mm-hmm.
Charlie?
I like to think about sustainability, right? And in sustainability of these centers. So if we don't take patents and do licensing at reasonable, is either the government pays, essentially all this is free and the government keep paying to keep all the machineries going, or the centers licensing to keep the research going. So at the end of the day, somebody pays. The question is whether we take intellectual property to keep this center going and become sustainable in the long term, or we keep going 5 years at a time back to the government begging for money. So I think the intellectual property question is more about who is going to pay to do the research to benefit society, and maybe how do you see things evolving to what that sort of more business-ish approach, or the Gates Foundation deciding the agenda for the CGR system.
That's correct. I think in addition to that, though, there is a sense in which research has shown that when public sector bodies embrace patentability, it changes their behaviour. They spend a huge amount of money on parts of the university, and people celebrate the one or two patents as successful. No one sits down and says, how much does this cost? There should be an audit of every intellectual property office, thing at every institution in Australia to work it out. People get promoted differently. Grants, studies in the 1990s showed in the UK, in Scotland in particular, there was a long-term study done that showed people got internal funding if they were perceived to be doing research that was more likely to be patentable. And so it does have an impact upon behaviour.
Question, Meryl?
I think it's a difficult conversation because patenting and IP already exists. I mean, if you could just wipe it from the world, that would be fine. I've found in my experience that whenever I've wanted to talk to a company to actually take my work from the lab bench out to the market, I can't even get through the door unless I could show them a patent, that I hold a patent.
Mm-hmm.
That's one example. The second example is that sometimes when we've been developing a product, we need other intellectual property. And if you have a patent, you have something that's tradable. But if you have nothing, then you can't even get started because you can't even get a license from whoever owns the intellectual property that you need. Golden rice is a really interesting example. I mean, this might support your argument. I remember them saying there were 80 licenses they had to get before they could even produce it. Mm-hmm. So it seems to me a very complicated area. I know Australian politicians are often remiss because they think, well, if we don't have the IP, we'll just buy it. But sometimes you can't buy it. Like in the early days of transgenic plants, nobody could buy the 35S promoter and Monsanto had it locked up. So you really need something that you can trade with.
Okay. There's a lot in that. The complexity of the golden rice is something that a lot of technologies, there are hundreds and hundreds of things. I think the golden rice is not unusual in that sense. There are many different ways in which things can be translated and adopted, and intellectual property is certainly one of them. But I think that there needs to be much more attention given to the cost, and it might just be that institutions need to get involved in adoption. Like at the moment, the University of Queensland is involved in vaccine delivery. Because of the problems they had. So it could be that if they can't get someone to do it, they'll move to do it themselves. Okay. Good to go.
I'd like to ask a question.
Yeah.
Some of my naive experiences with interacting with CSIRO, for example, is the difficulty of collaboration due to the protection of intellectual property and the ownership of material and this is CSIRO, and the same with the University of Queensland, and we've had to have all these contracts in place, and a lot of those contracts are in place are about the ownership of the intellectual property. When if you thought about it, well, this is the Australian-owned intellectual property, then none of those contracts would even need to exist, and we'd have this, massive flow of information and freedom of all that sort of stuff. Well, within the government, if you thought about it from the government sector, so that's my question. Is that what you're wanting to do? Because if I understand this is a research question, not an opinion that you're putting forward necessarily.
No,
it's a research where you're going to look at the costs of these things and actually understand what is the actual cost and benefit of the current system, and what are its weak points, and where could we improve it? Is that your goal?
That's our goal, 100%. Okay. Yeah, and I just gave two examples of situations where the non-1980s intellectual property models have been used successfully, and we're just looking at those as an example, and then we're going to turn our attention to look at universities. We're going to probably look at a couple of success stories and see, and then cost them out and talk to people. But that's exactly what we're going to do.
Yeah. I think just to follow on, I think it would be great to we've got CSIRO as a partner, and it'd be great to have some really deep conversations with them, I think, because I'm really interested to be in a fly on the wall with some of your university discussions, for sure. Are there any other questions? People shaking their head, they want to go and look at the posters. So let's go and look at the posters. What a great session. David's going to tell us how to get to the posters.
And that's far too complicated. So it's at the Global Change Institute. People from UQ, just wave your hands up in the air and follow them. Otherwise, follow me and I'll walk there.